everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is all about all of the books I read in the month of February. Welcome to my wrap up. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and today's video is about the not too many books that I read in the month of February. And I was carrying on with my 30 book challenge, trying to not buy books until I'd read 30 books I already own. So I'll let you know how I'm getting on with that challenge today, and also there will of course be an update on the status of the Giant TBR and its numbers at the end of the video. There was slightly less progress on my challenges than in January, and this was largely because I started judging the Booktube Prize octafinals, and so I did read 3 out of my 6 books for that, and they were all library books. So library books did creep back in the month of February. So I read in total 14 books, and that added up to 4,498 pages of reading. One of these books was an ebook that I borrowed from Libby, one was an audiobook, one was a reread, 3 were library books for the Booktube Prize, and that meant that I read 1 book that I had acquired during the month and 7 books from the Giant TBR. So before we get started on what I did read, there were a couple of books that I didn't finish, and the first one was another audiobook which I was listening to for most of the month, and that was Night Crawling by Layla Motley. I picked this one up because it was longlisted last year for the Booker Prize, and I was very interested to get to it because a lot of my friends had really enjoyed it. And I have actually finished this book now, but I finished it on the 1st of March, so I'm going to leave that and talk about it a bit more in my wrap up for March, because I think I will have had more time to digest and think about it. So that was one that I was carrying on into March, which is now finished, and I have one more physical book which I'm continuing into March, which was always intended to continue into March, although I am a little bit behind with it, and that's The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. I'm reading this for a read along with the lovely Becky from Teacup the Storyteller, and a lovely group of people that she has brought together to read her favourite book of all time, and I'm really enjoying The Three Musketeers. I'm up to page 482, so you can see I'm more than halfway. I'm not quite as far along with this as I should be. I think I'm about a week behind, but hope to finish this within a couple of weeks of the start of March. So let's get on to the books that I did read in the month of February, and I have 3 books for the Booktube Prize, which I am not allowed to talk about until the octafinals round is finished. So these 3 books I'm not going to be talking about today, but I have recorded my wrap up of each book as I go along. They will all be collected together in my Booktube Prize reading vlog, which will come out at the start of April after we've heard the results of the octafinals round. So just to tell you what they were Glory by No Violet Bulawayo, Carrie Soto Is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and most recently Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I did read those 3 in the month of February, but I will be talking about them in April, so watch this space. Everything else that I read in February I will talk about in this video. Everything that I read in February was at least good. I think looking back on the ratings that I've given things, I actually rated everything that I'm going to talk about today at like 3.5 stars and above, and I'm going to talk about them roughly from least favourite to most, but to be honest, most of these books were either a 3.5 star or a 4-star read, and I found it very difficult to put them in a particular order apart from my favourites of the month. Let's start with Gimme a Kiss by Christopher Pike, and this was an acquisition during the month. My husband kindly bought me this for Valentine's Day along with 3 other Christopher Pike books, so yeah, I started with this one. I don't think I ever read this in my teen years, but I did really enjoy Christopher Pike's books when I was in high school, and yeah, I used to get these out of the high school library and borrow them from my friend who had a big collection. This was my first time reading Gimme a Kiss, although I have watched the Midnight Club adaptation recently. I do have a video about that if you want to check it out. And one of the books that they adapted as a subplot was Gimme a Kiss, and I couldn't really remember reading this book until I was a little way in how they had adapted that, so I may have to go back to the series and re-watch now that I've read the book. So yeah, Gimme a Kiss is like, I read this in an evening. It was great fun. I always have fun with Christopher Pike books, and they're very much of their sort of 80s time, very much teen sort of books. Before YA was a thing, we had teen books, and this was one. So this is about teenagers, and it's about Jane, whose diary has been published in school and everyone has read it, and the problem is that Jane was actually lying in her diary. Of course, everybody thinks it's her actual diary, and yeah, so this is kind of about that, and kind of about Jane's decision about what she does next. Of course, because it's Pike, there is an elaborate revenge plot, of course, and yeah, this was just like, I want to say this was absolute nonsense, but in the absolute best way. So had so much fun reading this. The motivations in it by the end were revealed to be ridiculous in the extreme. Yeah, very, very fond of Christopher Pike. It gave me the nostalgia factor, and I will very much be looking forward to reading the other three that I acquired recently. So yeah, this was a really fun end to the month. I had one evening to spare, so I read this. Next up, A Bone to Pick by Charlaine Harris. This is the second book in the Aurora Teagarden series, and I'm reading that along with the Into the Library read-along, which is hosted by the lovely Ange over at Ange's Book Chatter, and the lovely Amy at Booktube with Amy. A Bone to Pick was the second one. It was a reread, and when I read it, since I read it quite a long time ago, I had no recollection of this plot whatsoever. In fact, I had less recollection of this one than the first one. I'd written in my book journal previously that this one was my least favourite, but actually on a reread I could not only tell why it had been my least favourite from this omnibus first time round, but I could also like tell how I have matured as a reader maybe, because yeah, I think what I didn't love about this first time round is bound to be the fact that it's like a cold case. There's not really a murder in this, and so compared to the first one where there's several murders, this just didn't quite live up to that, I think, first time round for me. This time I actually really enjoyed the sort of quieter mystery element and how Aurora dealt with that. I thought Aurora was becoming a bit of a better rounded character in this one. Without really spoiling this, there's also a really nice little subplot with a cat, and when I read this the first time, I didn't actually like cats, but since I've had my own cat, Harry, I do like cats, so I really appreciated the cat subplot, and I don't think I would have appreciated that the first time I read it. Yeah, again with Aurora, I had fun. It was a quick read and a fun read, not something that was too taxing for my brain or that I will probably think about in years to come. But it was fine. It was an enjoyable read. Next up, these books are definitely all in my very good category. I gave all of these 4 stars and above, and very difficult to separate them and rank them. So let's start with the ebook that I read, which was Are You Listening by Tilly Walden. This is my first experience of Tilly Walden, and I first came across her because she was recommended to me by Jack over at Spread Bookjoy. Jack shared a link to a book that was free online, the name of which escapes me, but I'll put it on screen, and I haven't read that one yet, but I thought I would try this one because it was the one that Libby had. I've been reading some quite heavy books this month. One morning I just felt like a bit of a break from that, so I read this delightful graphic novel. This probably only took me about an hour to read, and it was a really enjoyable hour. Sort of a book about trust and friendship and road trips and cats, and yeah, it was feel good. It had darker plot lines in it for sure, but I really liked the mixture between the dark and the light and the fantasy and the reality. It was a really lovely read, and I will definitely check out the rest of Tillie Walden's work. Loved the artwork, thought the characters were great, and yeah, that was Are You Listening by Tillie Walden. Next up, another graphic book. This one, I wouldn't actually call this a graphic memoir. I'd say it's more of like a graphic travel diary. This is Pyongyang by Guy Delisle, and this one is translated by Helge Dasher. And this is about Guy Delisle's trip to North Korea. Guy Delisle is an animator, and he went to North Korea as part of that work. Was sort of animating for a studio and like basically editing the animations that people had done out there. So yeah, this kind of charts his trip and is an interesting trip and an interesting read. This one was a gift from Gemma Books for Christmas, and I'm really pleased that I've read it. It's great to carry on reading like graphic non-fiction, which I'm really enjoying at the moment. And I really did enjoy the drawing style in this one. Guy Delisle has quite a distinctive little cartoonish style, and I really enjoy that. And I've heard he has written other sort of travel biography books about different countries that he's been to while animating. Really liked this book. It did make me think. I felt like there's probably more to learn, but what I did learn I found really interesting, and I would definitely read another of Guy Delisle's books. So yes, this one was a hit as well. The next book I read for Criminalese, Garb August 1.5 Wasted Weekend. This was a weekend where you read a trashy book to mark there being 6 months left to the next round of Garb August itself. So yes, I read a book that I wouldn't describe as particularly trashy, but it's a TV tie-in, and TV tie-ins are supposed to be inherently trashy, so that's what I picked because that was what I was in the mood for. And this was Last Human by Doug Naylor, which is a Red Dwarf book. I really enjoyed reading a Red Dwarf book in Garb August as well, and this one was no different. And my only sadness with this one is that there's only one more Red Dwarf book left that I haven't read. I really like these. I think that they really successfully combine like sort of material that was in the Red Dwarf series. It also brings out extra elements that probably like couldn't be expanded as much. So this does expand on episodes of Red Dwarf, and I really enjoyed it. I did laugh out loud at this one several times, and I do like a funny book, and this one was very cheerful. So too many things happen in this to probably describe, but if you've watched Red Dwarf, then this is like watching Red Dwarf but even better. I enjoyed following Lister. This one has Kachansky in it as well, and all the other cast of characters that we know and love, Crichton, Kat, and of course Rimmer. So yeah, I had a great time with this book, and I will probably be reading the last one that I haven't read yet sometime later in the year. So yeah, another great book. Right, next up, a book I had extremely mixed feelings about, and that was Haunted by Chuck Palahnuik. Now, Chuck Palahnuik, I have read his most famous book, Fight Club, and my husband has read many more of Palahnuik's books, and this one was one that he owns and that I had put onto my TBR or as one of his books that I wanted to read. So when I asked him to pick me a book for my TBR for February, of course he chose this one. Now, one thing I really liked about Haunted was that it sort of has an overarching storyline about people who are on a supposed writer's retreat that has gone horribly wrong. It also, in between snippets of this story, this overarching storyline, we have a series of short stories, and the short stories profess to be by each of the different characters who is at this writer's retreat. And there's a real mixture of short stories in here, from funny to deeply, deeply disturbing. And yeah, there were times in this book where I did feel quite sick, but yeah, I still carried on reading because I wanted to know where Palahnuik was going with the overarching storyline, which, to be honest, in the end I was less impressed with than I was by the idea of it. There's also some poems in here that are about each of the different characters on the writer's retreat, so it's a great mixture of stuff. In the back, I really enjoyed reading Chuck Palahnuik's own notes. There's an afterword. So in the afterword, Palahnuik talks about how many people on his book tour, when he read the story Guts, fainted, and it's a lot. And I had actually read the story Guts before individually, because years ago when this book came out, there were obviously numerous articles about how people were fainting when Palahnuik was on this book tour reading this story. So of course I read it to see if it would make me faint, and it didn't. But I knew what to expect from that story, so I knew there were going to be some really disgusting elements to this book. Yeah, there are things that make you laugh in a really grossed out, disgusting kind of way in here, and there's also a story in here that I found much worse than Guts. It didn't make me faint or anything like that, but I just felt absolutely horrified by it. It was probably the most disturbing story I've read. Because of that, this isn't a book that I would really recommend. It has a read at your own risk advisory warning on the front, and that really tells you a lot about it. There were plenty of short stories in here that were not disturbing to me and didn't bother me. And as I say, there were some bits that sort of made me laugh or smile, but there were other bits that did make me feel either unnerved or just grossed out. And yeah, not sure if Palahnuik is definitely an author for me. I really did enjoy Fight Club. I wouldn't say I enjoyed the experience of reading this book, because there were times when I was in absolute disgust, and the story I was talking about definitely was probably the most disgusting, disturbing thing I would consider that I have read. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking about Haunted because, as it says, read at your own risk. I don't recommend it, but it is a well-written book. Next up, I do have a full review of this one, When Ghosts Come Home by Wiley Cash. Do check that out if you haven't already. And this was the book that I got from my Mr. B's Crime Syndicate subscription in January, and I did have a good time mostly with this. Bit disappointed by the ending, but yeah, check out my review if you want to hear more. Next up, we're getting quite near the top now. We have The Anomaly by Hervé Letellier, and this one is also translated. It was translated from the French by Adriana Hunter. This is a book that is possibly even weirder than I thought it was going to be. So it's a book about a plane that duplicates. So the plane goes into turbulence, and the first one lands in March, just after it's gone into the turbulence, and then a second duplicate of that plane lands 3 months later with the exact same passengers on it, and now those passengers all have doubles. This actually turned out to be a lot more philosophical than I would say it was a thriller. It did have very much thriller elements. I was very drawn in by the first chapter. I liked the way this follows the different characters on the plane, both before and after the incident on the plane, and it also follows the people who were on the second plane as they meet their doubles and find out what's happened in 3 months of life that they haven't had. It's a very strange book. I recommend you read it if that sounds at all like something you would like to read about. I quite enjoyed the blend of thriller and philosophical. Yeah, I don't want to say anything without spoilering it, but I thought it was clever and I would read Hervé Le Tellier again. Yeah, another book I did have a really good time with while reading it. The next book that I read towards the end of the month was One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I picked this up as a result of the poll that I ran to decide my February read, and so many people overwhelmingly picked this book. I wouldn't say I enjoyed this book because it's not an enjoyable book, it's a very bleak book, but I really admire this book. It was a really interesting study of one day in a labour camp, and it's deeply sad. It's really, really moving because there's little bits and pieces happening during the course of Ivan's day that make it for him a really good day, and it's just so sad thinking that that was a good day when it contains all the things that it did contain and he is imprisoned and so on. And yeah, it's a really sad book, but really, really worth a read. I very much thought that this was well written, a good insight into life. Again, this is translated. The translator was Ralph Parker, and there were certainly things in this translation that I thought were probably a bit strangely worded, so probably just like the wording of the time. I think this edition is from the 70s. I found it to be a really interesting, moving book anyway. I'm really, really glad that you all told me to read this book and that I finally got to it. So within these books I've talked about today, I didn't have a 5-star read, but I did have 2 favourites of the month. The first one is physical and the second one is audio, and the physical book is Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier. I read this for the FOMO Book Club that I'm hosting with Gemma from Gemma Books and Jack from Spread Bookjoy, and we talked about this book over on Gem's channel a few days ago, so go and check that out. I will link it in the description down below because we discussed this in a lot greater depth than I will be able to do here. Let me start by saying this wasn't my favourite du Maurier. I've also read some of her short stories. I've read My Cousin Rachel and I've read Rebecca, and for me, My Cousin Rachel and Rebecca I prefer because they are first-person narratives. They really, really gripped me. That's not to say that this didn't grip me, because it did. So what is really interesting and different about Jamaica Inn is that this one is much more action-packed than any other du Maurier I've read, and it's much more atmospheric. So set out on the moors and in the eponymous Jamaica Inn, which is a dark, dirty, horrible inn out in the middle of nowhere. This is where our main character, Mary Yelland, finds herself after the death of her mother. She goes to live with her Aunt Patience and her terrible uncle Joss, who is just so villainous. So yeah, this is the story of what Mary ends up caught up in. There was some wonderful, wonderful writing in this, and yeah, we do discuss that further in our live discussion. This book definitely keeps you turning the pages. It's very, very gripping. There's some really powerful writing in places in this that I can't talk about without giving you spoilers, but I loved it. So I'm really eager to get to even more Daphne du Maurier and see if other books of hers are like this, or if they're more like sort of quieter and more psychological, like Rebecca and like My Cousin Rachel. But she's definitely an author who I really, really enjoy reading. And my final favourite of the month is The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I listened to this on audio and it was a buddy read with Gemma from Gemma Books, and yeah, I really enjoyed this. It's written as a series of short stories that are interlinked. Some of the short stories were very short and just sort of gave flavours of what was going on Mars and on Earth, and some of them were longer short stories, some with really clever twists like Bradbury does. All of them with just gorgeous, gorgeous writing like Bradbury does. Bradbury has continued to impress me, has continued to be one of my latest favourite authors, and I just thought he was at his best in The Martian Chronicles. If you've enjoyed any of his other works and you haven't checked out The Martian Chronicles yet, I would highly suggest that you do. And I also think that these worked well enough as connected short stories that it did kind of come across as a complete narrative, as a novel. So I thought that worked really, really well. So if you're maybe not so much of a fan of short stories, maybe start here with Bradbury, because although it's short stories, he has made it into a successful novel in my opinion. If you like sci-fi, you like stories about Martians and humans, then I would recommend this. So those were all of the books that I read in the month of February, with the exception of the Booktube Prize books, which I'll talk about later. In terms of the 30 book challenge, I have now read 17 out of 30 books, so still a way to go, still 13 to read. Was hoping to finish by the end of March, but I don't think that's going to happen now with the Booktube Prize and with the possibility that I may be reading a lot of things for the Women's Prize. Finally, in this video, it's time to check in with the Giant TBR, and when we left the Giant TBR at the end of last month, it was standing at 169 books. And I did say in that video that I hoped not to acquire any books in February, but that went a bit wrong. If you've watched my sort of mini book haul and book unboxing, you will see why. So I acquired my book subscription book, which I am currently reading in the month of March, so that took us up to 170 books. I acquired 4 Christopher Pike books, 3 of which I've not yet read, so I'm not going to add the one that I did read. I'm adding these 3, which means we're going up to 173. And I also won a book in a giveaway, which takes us up to 174. Fortunately, I did read 7 books from the Giant TBR. That was Last Human, Pyongyang, Jamaica Inn, The Anomaly, Haunted, When Ghosts Come Home, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. So yes, 7 books read takes us down to 167 books. Now, I know that's only 2 lower than last month. I am a bit disappointed with myself that we could have made a much bigger difference had I not been winning books and getting books as presents, but there we go. Can't say no to book presents. So I need to try not to gain any books in March. I need to try to limit my reading from the library to my prize reading books. Let's hope that I can get the 30 book challenge done and dusted either in March or April, and that we don't add too much to the TBR. Do let me know in the comments, what have you been reading in February? What was your favourite of the month? And yeah, no DNFs this month. All enjoyable books that I read in their own ways. If you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already. And I will hope very much to see you all again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.